Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China and the world. This program is part of a special series in which Polaris Live invited 7 experts from the United States, China, and the Middle East to offer their perspectives on the recently concluded 20th Communist Party Conference in Beijing. These programs are brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. It's a great pleasure for me to have as my guest today on Polaris Live, Dr. Pamela Crossley. She is a specialist on the Qing Empire, modern Chinese history, and also researches and writes on Central and Inner Asian history, global history, and the imperial sources of modern identities. She's the author of 8 books, including China's Global Empire, Qing, Hammer and Anvil, Nomad Rulers at the Forge of the Modern World, and The Wobbling Pivot, China since 1800, widely published in the world's leading scholarly journals, including Harvard Review of Asiatic Studies, American Historical Review, Journal of Asian Studies, and China File. She has also been awarded the Jerome Goldstein Award for Distinguished Teaching. Crossley is an original fellow appointee of the Dartmouth Society of Fellows, where, of course, she is a professor. So, Dr. Crossley, we're awed to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to see you again.
Listen, we've all been talking about, the media's been talking about this just concluded conference in Beijing, the week-long conference that's held every 5 years to kind of shuffle the deck and appoint new leaders and so on. What I want to do is see if you can help us put this in perspective, right? You looked at China through multiple prisms and Chinese empires. So how do you interpret the current view of virtually every mainstream U.S. journal and across the U.S. political spectrum that China wants to break the world order? Is the meeting that has just concluded pretty much in line with how China has chosen its leaders over the centuries, over the millennia? I mean, obviously now we have the internet and, the flash and gimmick of modern photography, but put this in perspective for us.
Okay, I'm not telling you anything when I tell you that I am always skeptical about this idea that there's something about history that has inexorably molded the present and the future. I think, there are many, many more sort of unpredictable elements than we normally credit. And in the case of China, this is a particular problem because since World War II, there's always been this tendency to give a lot of deference to China's history. So as if it has, because it has a long history, therefore maybe its history is more sort of formative than the countries with shorter histories. I mean, really, everything is pretty much predicted shaped in any country by the past 10 or 20 years. So really how many hundreds or thousands of years there were before that just maybe not so important an issue in terms of thinking about political strategies and economic configurations and so on. So in the case of China, if you're talking about this sort of model that has been, I think, influential, or was, now I'm really not so sure, but that was for decades very influential among American strategic thinkers, that, yeah, China is somehow out to break the world order. There's a couple of things. I would say that I think that did already happen in the 20th century. The end of the Cold War really did start with China. I do believe this, and its nuclear test in the 1960s. I mean, it was China that more than any other country, not China exclusively, but China more than any other, that sort of took apart that bipolar pattern that we called the Cold War and made it a tripolar sort of dynamic. And that was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And I really don't think 1989, end of and later end of the Soviet Union in 1991. I just don't think that those were things produced by the process of ending the Cold War. Now, after the Cold War, did we really have a world order at all? And here I think there was a school of people who were thinking, yes, there are rules, there are these responsible stakeholders. There's this way you have to do it, and those rules have been determined by the United States largely, and that the United States is at the top of it. And so then you have people trying to drag in all of these sort of classically colored strategic models, and Thucydides trap and all of this stuff. I think a lot of this is illusory. This is a projection by the people who are doing this. I don't think there's been a world order for a very long time, so China can't really be trying to break it.
Okay. So, because I mean that's pretty much, and today I mean The Economist has their newest issue. The cover says the world that China wants, So obviously, but then this always kind of takes me back, even though I'm an amateur hobbyist historian of China, as you well know, takes me back to the China, and takes me back to America, and one wonders about so many things that go into what the Chinese are doing. But let me ask you about one. Much is made of the Century of Humiliation. That has a lot to do with the way China behaves, and as if I understand correctly, that's actually taught in every school in China, so that the students know the Century of Humiliation. Do you think that it really is as meaningful today as it was, Pamela? Or do you think that it's used more or less to put people off balance? That, hey, you guys, were ruled us for a century. You did all these horrible things. Can you add some thought on that?
Well, this, once you get invested in an idea like this that can become very real, very powerful. So I think there are people, particularly in sectors of the Chinese domestic administration, and particularly in education and so on, who may take this very seriously. And this is a very, very powerful font of rhetoric in international relations. It's not, I mean, as I say, history is whatever people put into it. China, if Chinese educators found in the 20th century that what had happened between, say, 1850 and 1950 had been a century of humiliation, then that's the way they saw it. China certainly had phenomenal difficulties in the 19th century, as many places in the country, in the world did have. And Europe and European imperialism was a factor in all of these scenarios, but a varying factor. Now, China, one thing I think that would impress you very powerfully if you study Chinese history is that we're talking about an economy, cultural continuities, an organized society on a scale that was really not like anywhere else in the world. And there are only very, very few little episodes where any kind of external society or state had any determinative influence on China. The great changes in China have come from China. This was true in the 19th century. They had the world's most destructive, most fatal civil war, and the aftermath of it just didn't go in the direction of putting China back together and making it competitive with the other countries around it. So that all happened. Is that humiliation? I don't know. If the Chinese say it is, then it is. But really, that is not, you know, that is not a comprehensive way of looking at the history of the 19th century, even in China. Now, this is a very powerful source of rhetoric, and China has used this very effectively, not just Century of Humiliation, but World War II, used that in its relations with Japan very, very effectively, just pulling out this rhetorical, look what you did to us in World War II. That really, that can have a little, it can give you a little bit of leverage. But it isn't going to change anything that's very important. It's just a rhetorical resource. I think a lot of it is for domestic consumption. And, it's too bad those things happened to China in the 19th century, but they happened to a lot of people.
But I was going to press a little bit on that point. When you talk to your students about this, and for those people who are not as familiar with this term as we are, the Century of Humiliation refers to those 100 years when China was colonized, the Brits especially, but also to some extent the Americans sold opium, did horrible things, opened up ports and so on. But I was very interested in what you just said, is that only China can change China. Over the millennia, the outside influences have done a little bit, but it's basic. So how does that connect with what appears to be American policy at this point, which is to use tariffs, and which is to use, if I may use the phrase, containment and so on, to bend China, if you will, to the West's will? Is that a project that is doomed to fail because of what you've just said?
Well, a lot of policy people. I know a lot of policy people. I've never heard anybody say they wanted to bend China to the U.S. will. I've heard a lot of them say that they think there is a kind of a world order, that there are some rules, that there are some values, and that they would like to see them defended against what they see as a challenge from China in particular, not China exclusively, right? But from China in particular. So I do hear that, but this thing of, everything. I mean, really, in American foreign policy talk about China is institutionalized. It's always ongoing. It's not going to disappear. But at the present, just think of the past 2 or 3 years, this hasn't been the biggest issue for American policymakers. China's always there. It will always have to think about the Pacific Ocean. We'll always have to think about all the strategic issues involved. But trying to do China down is not a major goal of American policy making, so far as I can see from the evidence. Now, if somebody knows there's some secret, room where this is somehow or other, this is actually the controlling worry, then okay. But I don't see any evidence of that from what people are actually saying and doing. There's a continuing level of concern, attention about China, as there would be for any other great power, particularly one that occasionally says extremely hostile things about the United States. But at present, this is not what's on the minds of people who are making decisions about what to do in the United States.
Right. It's, just as an aside, while you were talking about, and we were talking about the Century of Humiliation, right? There are other countries, I was thinking of India specifically, which might point to 300 years of humiliation. And isn't it poetic that a second generation descendant from India is about to become the Prime Minister of Britain, which was, the largest empire in the world. The sun never set on the British Empire, and here we are. The things are things are changing so dramatically. And do you think this is just the winds of change that because uh, China is so huge, so rich, and so on, that we are going to see uh, not the eclipse of the West, but domination of the West by Chinese policies and trade, and it's like trying to stop a river rushing through a dam to try and do otherwise. That, I mean, America isn't going to go anywhere, but do we have to adjust to this new reality?
Well, that is exactly what was predicted for a very long time. I mean, I remember, you remember reading in whatever 2005, 2006 that by 2017 China would have the largest economy in the world. It's going to be, I mean, it's easy to predict those things when you're looking at scales. I mean, look at the scale of China itself, of its society, which is a very complex society, of its economy. It's easy to sort of say, ultimately, maybe this will be like the 18th century. China, the Chinese economy, Chinese society will actually be the dominant, most influential society in the world. And in the 18th century, that really was true. It isn't happening now because I think things happen. I mean, the path that China was on at the early part of the 21st century is not the path that it's on now, and this is actually, I think, relates to what is one of the true preoccupations of American foreign policy now, which is this democracy and autocracy thing. Xi Jinping has decided, for whatever reason, he's not the only one. He's part of a little clutch of world leaders who just decided, let's be autocrats and let's actually institutionalize fascism in various forms in order to support us. Well, okay, but that's in that case, you're going off the economic path of development that you've been on previously. I mean, it has recently become a little bit of a slogan in U.S. foreign policy, really for the first time. But historically, this has been around a long time. This is empirically true. You can't retain economic development of the sort China has enjoyed since the 1980s, 1990s. You can't continue that under an autocratic regime. And if we had any doubts, or we had any hopes previously that Xi Jinping was not going to go deeper into the direction of autocracy, they're lost after the 20th Congress. So.
But let me interrupt here and ask you. I mean, the Chinese always make it a point to say that they are not really the classic communist regime that the Soviet Union, for example, used to be. That they are really, in their words, socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
And what I want to ask you are two things. One, I have a feeling that it was American policymakers who, by wishful thinking, assumed that as they got rich, they would become like us.
Yes.
And they have this long history where whenever the center has weakened, as I recall, they've been invaded or empires have changed. So can it not be that they're not in the mold of a Hungary or a Russia or the other nationalists, the directions that countries are following, that they're following a very classic Chinese model that says for us to govern this huge landmass, 1.25 billion people, we need to have a different set of principles to do that. And yes, to increase our wealth and to modernize China, bring it to European standards someday, we need to have open markets. And it seems to me they've done both of that. So shouldn't we be accepting the fact that the world is going to be dominated by two powers, if you will, one with liberal democracy and one with this socialism with Chinese characteristics? That's the way it's going to be.
But yeah, I mean, the way that you've described the Chinese government rhetoric is absolutely, I think, accurate. That's exactly what they have said. Socialism can have Chinese characteristics, but it's got to have some socialist characteristics too. I mean, everything that had once defined socialism with Chinese characteristics in the latter part of the 20th century, these social supports, these patterns of popular participation, and it those those are exactly what have been dismantled and disrupted in 21st century China. So there's socialism with characteristics got to have a little socialism to it. It's very hard to find that in a real way in China now. On the other hand, autocracy can have Chinese characteristics too, and you can have autocracy with Chinese characteristics.
Yes.
I think that is more the kind of thing you say. Now, the difference, there is a difference. I would always argue with China and another, let's say, Turkey or Hungary, in the sense that because, well, I don't know, related to the fact that China is so big and so complex, I do not believe that autocracy can actually be effected in a serious kind of way. But you can disrupt lives. You can derail the economy, which looks, and in fact, that is the history of autocracy. I mean, it doesn't produce prosperity, nor does it produce any kind of personal freedom and realization and so on. And then, this thing that, I wrote in August of 2020, I remember I published a thing saying that a preoccupation with democracy is going to become a feature of American foreign policy. And that's because it's not because of the world, that's because of what's happening in the United States. That we are in this struggle now that is unlike previous struggles to preserve democracy. And in my view, it is not ideological. This is empirical. History doesn't really teach a lot of lessons, but it does teach this one, that there has never been discovered anywhere a defense against predatory government apart from democracy. And we've looked and looked and looked because democracy is so frustrating and it's so slow and it's so inconsistent, but it has not been found. And, nobody's even trying to find this in China.
Well, you remind me of Sir Winston Churchill's, one of his favorite phrases, right? That democracy is the worst form of government, excepting for the rest of them. So, but let me ask you, if I was to ask, sorry, go ahead.
Few truer things have ever been said, and this comes from somebody who's not a fan of Winston Churchill.
So, if I was to ask you, in your view, does America today have a policy for China, and if so, what do you think it is?
I really don't think there is. I think for most periods of time, America hasn't really had a foreign policy, right? I think there's been a lot more pragmatism than that. And I think there is a realization that has taken hold institutionally in the United States that China is going to be an independent variable in American global thinking, probably forever. So we're probably never going to come up with a policy that actually guides relations with a country like China. There are, even at times, people think, oh, things look bad now between US and China. We're still cooperating on things. It still happens. And the United, apart from the Korean War, the United States and China have never fought a war. They have had so much mutual interest in the global economy and in trade and in certain kinds of strategic issues, all the way back to the 1860s. That isn't any kind of a new thing. So I think one of the reasons that China in particular can be so kind of loose in its talk about the United States is that it knows very well the chances of any war with the United States at any time for any reason are so remote that you might as well, play around.
Really? You really believe that?
Yes, I do. I think people who really are looking, rhetoric aside, because rhetoric is very important. That's part of the way you control the domestic situation. And that's true here with our military budgets and our election rhetoric, and that's true in China. Yeah, so the talk is big and it's important, but I don't think it actually relates to real prospects for a war.
As we run into the last 5 minutes or so, I wanted to ask you. I wrote this report for the Foreign Policy Association a few weeks ago, right? The business of America and China is business, and I argued in the report that politicians on both sides, maybe because of the rhetoric, as you just pointed out, have totally failed to cool the daggers drawn attitude of both countries. But on the other hand, the business and finance people have moved ahead smartly on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
There's some 200-300 Chinese companies on Wall Street. China is the biggest market for so many American products. So I tried to argue in the report that the politicians ought to stand aside and, for a change, let the people who do business and finance take over and see what happens over a decade or so. Do you broadly agree with that? Do you think that's what we should do to get off this standstill?
Uh, well, I think actually we did have a period like that, in particularly in the 1990s, in which even the diplomatic rhetoric was actually being driven by these business interests, and of course, then you have individuals like, let's say, Henry Kissinger, who are constantly bridging this and trying to get political rhetoric to be more or less a front for business. I think that probably you do have to have some variations, right? There has to be a little bit of tension in these relationships. But if I'm going to be consistent with what I said before, those business interests, the economic interests, the trade interests that have bound the U.S. and China together since the latter part of the 19th century are always going to be fundamentally important. So ultimately, they will always be represented in the diplomatic rhetoric. On the other hand, I think no, professional diplomats, right? Professional spokesman, right, for our military sector and our strategic sector, they have to speak and they do have to hold the line on certain things, because otherwise you have this complete sort of pandering and capitulationism that really doesn't promote a healthy relationship between the US and China.
From everything you've said, one takeaway is very heartening, which is you said, don't just look at the rhetoric, look at what's happening every day. And things are, in fact, happening every day. And let's not forget that. And you've related the rhetoric to the domestic audience. And I think that that's a really powerful way for you as for a historian to make those points, because you come through the prism of many, many years. And I think that's so I really like you to say that. To conclude, we just have a minute or so. I'm going to turn around the question just that I asked you and say, do you think there is a policy, there's a strategy that China has for America?
Um, I think both. I think there are serious strategic thinkers who realize that the United States is probably not really ever going to withdraw from the Pacific world or even from the Indian Ocean. And so what we really have to do is figure out how far can we go without going too far, right? And that's a normal kind of relationship between two great powers. On the other hand, I think there is a danger because Xi Jinping, in particular, wants to survive. He wants his regime to survive. He wants it, and I think it is an obligation on the part of the United States to try to convince him to not paint himself into a corner on something like Taiwan, because rhetorically this is possible to do, and the Chinese public is not anything to play around with. You build up expectations of some kind, you have to find a way to fulfill them. This is just, that's the way it is in China. So Xi Jinping painting himself into a corner on something, let's say, like Taiwan, is a real risk. And the United States does have to be vigilant in every way, creative, sensitive,
Right.
every dimension to try to convince this guy, do not paint yourself into a corner on this.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, Dr. Pamela Crossley, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. And I want to really, really thank you for opening this series of 7 conversations over the next week, which we'll try to put some sense behind what's happened during this week in Beijing, what the future might bring. And so for that, I really thank you for joining us.
Yes, thanks for talking with me.
So I'm afraid that's all the time we have. And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode in this special series of programs, which is actually tomorrow, in which 7 experts from China, the United States, and the Middle East offer their perspectives on the recently concluded 20th Chinese Communist Party conference in Beijing, and what the conference results mean for the US, for China, and the world. So, I hope we have the pleasure of seeing you again tomorrow, and until then, this is Sarwar Kashmeri. Goodbye.